Right, Sarah, what is tip number 3, please?
Okay, tip number 3 is my favorite one. This is my little geek love. And it's one that I spoke about a few years ago. I sort of did some work with Harry Fletcher Wood on it as well. It is to beware of biases. And it's something that as a young teacher, I had no idea about. And just as I've been teaching now for about, 11 years. So across the course of those 11 years, just figuring out exactly what is going on in my students' minds when, for example, I have a student who I've given, has not received anything under an A star for an essay across the course of the year, and yet still fundamentally believes that they will do badly. Like, what is happening in their processing that is that them being super anxious? All the feedback I've given will have been positive, will have been wow, whatever it is, and yet somehow that's being interpreted as still a potential to fail. And on the opposite end of that, students who you have been, hammering and who have been receiving D's and D's and are very confident that they will be completely fine in the final exam. So just thinking about this a little bit more and using that to perhaps have a bit better conversations with students by just thinking about where they might be lying on that spectrum of a sort of complete negatively bias or a bit too much illusory superiority is the other way.
Wow, I love a bit of bias. This is right up my street, this one. I can certainly relate to teaching both those types of students, the supremely overconfident and then the ones who should be a bit more confident. What can you do, Sarah? What are some of those conversations that you can have with those students? What works in both cases?
Yeah, so again, it's thinking about trying to think about exactly where those students are lying in regards to their own belief. With top-end students who are particularly critical, I did some studies on this a few years ago, and it was so interesting because I asked them to rank themselves in the class, and they genuinely believed that they were probably middle to bottom. And I think that is so even just having that conversation, where do you think you sit in the class is a really nice way to just see how that student's feeling about themselves. But funnily enough, after doing that, and then you have that conversation no, you've been top, but then you become aware as a teacher that actually I know that, but of course they don't, because in the process of taking in work and marking and looking at it, we have a very good overview, don't we, of how all the kids are performing, but they don't see that. And so again, and it does really come down to using models, really, fundamentally using models, but also having very astute and honest discussions with students. So I guess it's sort of using models with coaching is what I would say is the best way to do it. So a really good example is that I had a boy a few years ago. Again, he was that perfect, really genuinely believed that he would be fine in the final examination. And I had been giving him an essay for a while, and his context was worth sort of 30% in this essay, was so weak. And I couldn't tell you the amount of times where I was like, use more context. You need to have more context. You need to include more context. And I decided that I would sit him down and I sort of asked him to rank the learning objectives for this essay out of 10 to see how strong he was. So he gave himself 10 for his ideas because, he thought he was really, really good. And his ideas were good. So I didn't sort of necessarily dispute that one. But then he did say to me, I know you've said that I need more context, so I'm giving myself an 8, right, instead of a 10. And I'm like, okay. And I said, all right, this is really interesting for me because I would have ranked him out of 10 about a 2 in context. It was so clear that he knew it wasn't his best thing. So actually my feedback was being completely disregarded because he knew it. He's like, oh, I'll listen. And to him, adding more context meant maybe a sentence. So the best thing that I think I did at this point is I took another student's essay and I said, look, this is an 8. Read the context here. Let's highlight the context. This is a context 8. And he was like, oh my God, I am a 2. You know, it's that recalibration of where he sat because he was able to see something that was, you know, again, recalibrating his view of himself. And I think, like I said, I think models are key for this, and coaching is a bit of key, just to enable students to see exactly where they are and exactly how they sit. And I think models are the best way as well, not to make it personal, just be like, ask students, how good do you think you are at this? You know, what do you think you've done wrong here? Where, you know, out of 10, quantify this level of skill here for me. And even working the other way, a student might say, oh, well, I think I'm a 2. You're like, no, actually, this is a 2. You're sitting, you know, as a way to build confidence if you need to.
This is interesting, right? I like to try and ask the awkward questions wherever possible on this show. So here's an awkward one. I can see this working really well, this kind of almost kind of comparative judgment approach, or, you know, using exemplars. I can see this working really well with 2 types of students. So your overconfident students who need to kind of realise that they're not quite as good as perhaps they think they are, and also your lower confident students who are a lot better than they kind of think they are. What about your students who are low confident but also are really struggling? Because I'm thinking, you know, they think they're struggling, and then they see, actually, you know what, you are probably getting a 3 or something on this. Is that going to kind of, as soon as you start ranking kids or, you know, comparing, you could imagine for some kids it starts to go the other way. Is that a concern? How does that play out?
Yeah. No, and that is the complete other end of that. So when we have students with illusory superiority in the bottom end, but you've also obviously got the other students. What is really interesting is that obviously this builds in as well with the sort of negativity that is employed upon students when you're in a setting school. You know, if you completely set for a long time, you see a positive progress model at the top end, but a negative usually in the middle to the low, because students get into that bias that I am bad at this and I'm not good at this, and they build that narrative. So they actually did do a study in this in 2008, comparing the way that students thought about themselves in regards to how much progress they made. And they looked at that exact comparison. So low achieving students, one who believed that they were really good and one who didn't. And they saw that the student who believed they were really good made more progress across the course of the year, not necessarily because they were good, but because they were taking more creative risks. So it was about the sort of positive belief in self that encouraged more risk-taking and learning, whereas when you have that negative belief, there seems to be less movement into taking risk in general. In the top end, this is a different effect, because in the top end, if you've got a top-performing student who has a massive belief in themselves, they actually make more mistakes because their error detection goes down, because they're taking more risks and their error detection goes down. So that was a really interesting study, I thought. So that's Warren's in 2008, about how you think about yourself and how that then impacts your motivation. So what you could do about that, I mean, and who was it? It was Mark. Boys Don't Try is a great book for this as well. He speaks about this in regards to learning and identity and memory, and then obviously that all linking into motivation. So it's a very similar thing with low achieving. It's to break down that narrative and retaliate against that narrative that I can't do this, I'm not good. That absolute truth that student believes is part of their identity. And showing them where, no, actually, look, you have done this, you've done that really well there, and actually lifting that student up so that they're taking more risks, because with more risk will come that progress later.
Wow, this is fascinating. Just one final reflection from me on this, Sarah. So I have a website, diagnosticquestions.com, and we did a big study about three or 4 years ago now, where we took 10,000 kids' results. And what we do on our app is when kids vote whether they think the answer is A, B, C or D for a multiple choice question, we did an experiment where we asked them to decide how confident they felt in the answer. It's like a 5-point emoji scale. So therefore, for each kid, we had a measure of their kind of accuracy, and then we also had a measure of their confidence. So it was kind of a measure of their understanding versus their perception of their understanding. And it was fascinating because the first thing was the spread of results was all over the show. So you had your classic overconfident kids and your underconfident kids. And you had that at all kind of achievement levels. It wasn't the fact that it was, lower achieving students were underestimated. It was spread out all over the show. But the most, well, I don't know if it's surprising or whatever, but one real clear finding came out was that boys really, far more than girls, overstate their perception of their understanding is far greater than their actual understanding, again, at all achievement levels. So it wasn't just the case that, lower achieving boys are more confident than lower achieving girls, or higher achieving boys are more confident than higher achieving girls. At every achievement level, the boys were more confident than the girls. It's fascinating, isn't it? Because there's no biological reason why that should be the case or whatever, but it's probably anecdotally everyone can think of these kind of overconfident boys, but it's fascinating when data plays that out, isn't it?
Completely, and I think that's something, again, sort of slightly touched upon by Mark in his when he's talking about boys and their achievement and boys don't try, etc., that maybe at times when we maybe that's got to do with how we're processing our feedback towards those students, that maybe because we see a boy who's generally a low achiever and then they do something really well, we say, oh my God, that's so amazing. Maybe we do that sometimes. And then that perpetuates their understanding. Their understanding, of being better than what they think they are. But I think the best thing to do is try and figure out exactly where that student lies, because I think even knowing that you've got a lower achieving boy who does have that illusory superiority, does think they're more confident, that is actually really a really useful thing for you to know as a teacher, because then you can help be like, actually you haven't done this right, and you can make sure that you are recalibrating their understanding of where they're at, so that they are making progress in the way that you need. A really good example which was given about this is when you would write, so if in English, if you're annotating an essay, you would put it on a scale. It would be like a sum, a clear, a developed, and an outstanding. That's usually how the mark schemes sort of go, and evaluative at the top. And so if I was to write some wider reading done, on the column, that would probably be a level 2 out of a level 5. So that would be a low. Some wider is like, it's okay. But somebody who does have that illusory superiority would be like, yeah, I did. Yes, I did some wider reading. Yes, I'm so glad they're acknowledging that. Because some wider reading done is actually, can be very much read as a positive. So again, if for that student, maybe perhaps, more wide reading needed is a better way to give feedback there, or to annotate that essay, rather than what you might do where you're like some, because you're trying to say you're a level 2, whereas actually that's being misinterpreted.
Got it. Last question. I could speak to you all day about this, but last question on this bias thing. Well, it's kind of a cheeky one. There's 2 parts to this question. So I really like this phrase, kind of calibration. I really like this idea of trying to bring students' perception of their understanding in line with their actual understanding. So my 2 parts to the question are this. One, is there any exception to that where actually you'd want a child to almost not realise where their understanding is? Is there any case you can make where you want perhaps a lower achieving child, you actually want them to feel better than perhaps their achievement level warrants? And the second part is, over time, the more you do these kind of comparative judgment things and exemplars and feedback, do you find that the calibration improves, that kids generally get a better sense of where they are actually at?
Yes, so again, I think, and I would love, obviously this research with biases is quite new. So I think ultimately, watch this space on how that's developing. But what has come out in education so far does seem to suggest that if we can encourage students to, at the lower end, to feel a little bit more positive and then negative about their ability, that they will then take more risks in their learning, which will lead to better progress, like I said. So I think there is a case to be made for some students that encouragement and creative risk-taking at least they're trying, and by trying they're going to get something down. So fundamentally, they'll probably do better than if they got nothing down, right? So there would be quite an obvious reason why a student trying to do better would do better than a student who's not. So yes, I do think that. I think the other really interesting thing that has come out, though, is that actually negativity bias can be a motivator. So there are some papers that suggest at the top end, and I guess that sort of rides into a little bit of what we see with high-performing people not feeling like they're doing it well enough, that actually their negativity bias is a key motivator in their success. So in understanding that, I think it's interesting to then see, right, is this negativity bias at the top end, is this detrimental to that student? Is that perfectionism? Is it bordering perfectionism, which then actually does become something pastorally that you could look into? But otherwise, if it's just that they want to succeed, they want to do better, making sure that, again, it's just about clarity, right? You want to do better. Okay, well, let's work on this then. Let's push that extra level. So it's not saying, oh, they've got a negative bias, they need to know they're amazing necessarily, because if that negativity bias is a slight motivator in that student's work ethic, then it actually can be used and can be sort of, captured to help move that student and motivate that student further.
Absolutely fascinating stuff.